Welcome, everyone. We're glad to see you today. Hopefully you're staying safe and somewhat dry if you're here in California, or even if you're not here in California, it's wintertime. So hopefully you're safe, dry, and warm. I'm Darla Cooper. I'm the Executive Director for the IRPE Group, the Research and Planning Group for California Community Colleges. And we're having this webinar today as part of our journey as an organization to share what we've been creating, some of our work with the IRPE community in mind, but hopefully will also be helpful to others. And I'm joined by my very esteemed colleagues, Alyssa Nguyen, Hannah Lawler, and Daniel Miramontes from San Diego Miramar College. Hannah is from Santa Monica. And we are all members of the organization's EDI Committee, our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. And so that committee's been hard at work for the last couple of years, and we're finally able to share a couple of our products with you today. You also see on here Nisa Julian, who works with Daniel at Miramar College. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be with us today, but she was a key contributor, not just to this presentation, but to the work that Daniel will be describing later. So let's go to the next slide. So just in case you are not familiar with the IRPE Group, we are an independent nonprofit organization that offers professional development and conducts research and evaluation. And we got our start and still are the membership organization for the researchers and planners in the California Community College system. Next slide, please. Nope, back one. So our agenda today, I'm going to get us started out with just giving you a little brief background on how we got here with this work, where we are, the outcomes for today, and who was involved in creating the two tools that we're sharing. And those will start with the self-assessment tool, and Alyssa will take us through that. We will share a little bit about our pilots that we did. We did a couple of pilots internally at the IRPE Group, and then we were thankful, and because San Diego Miramar was gracious enough to pilot the tool at their college. So we will be hearing from Daniel on that. And then we will have a little bit of time for Q&A. Then we will turn it over to Hannah, who has been working diligently to get our EDI glossary over the finish line. So she will kind of share with you how that's laid out, what our intentions were there, how you might be able to use that. And then we'll close again with more time for questions about the glossary. Next slide, please. So since 2020, we have been working to figure out what is our commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion. How can we become a more anti-racist organization? This was obviously accelerated by George Floyd's murder, but equity has been one of our longstanding core values as an organization. But that year, combined with the pandemic, just made it much more front and centered, and really wanted to make sure that we were walking that talk. So, we really, in doing our own journey, because we are a membership organization and because we serve the California Community College systems and higher education at large, we wanted to try to create tools and resources that others can use, not just, for ourselves. So we are, again, making sure that we're doing our part and looking internally and reflecting. But if others can learn and from our journey, learn from our successes and our challenges, we want to be able to share that. Next slide, please. So for today, we really just have kind of two outcomes for you. We want to make sure that you are familiar with the tool and the glossary, and that hopefully you'll leave today with one or two practical, ways, ideas that you might be able to use the tool and or the glossary at your college, or if you're not at a college, your organization. So that's our hope for today. And then I think my last slide is just to say, if you go to just want to acknowledge the people who worked really hard. The EDI committee we had in our first couple of years, we've had 2 work groups or subcommittees, and the committee there, you see everyone's name. It represented about half the whole committee, and they were assigned to create the framework, which we shared previously with you all, and it is on our website, and to design the self-assessment tool, which came out of that framework, and as well as the glossary. And then Hannah and I came in later to kind of help with both of those tools, again, to help complete the design and get them ready to be shared with you today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to get us started with the self-assessment tool.
Thank you, Darla. So the self-assessment tool that we'll be sharing with you all today is based on our EDI framework that is comprised of 4 components as a way for us to operationalize or concretize how we as an organization will be advancing equity. So as a quick sort of refresher on the 4 core components of the EDI framework, the first component is what we call equity-minded, and it's just a perspective or lens that underpins the way we conduct our business and our work, and centers that work around recognizing and trying to redress systems of oppression in our policies, practices, and actions. The second core component is cultural humility, and it's our ability to reflect critically upon and acknowledge your own biases, perspective, shortcomings, and limitations on our expertise as part of the process of learning and building the capacity to improve our communities and the communities that we serve. The third component is evidence-based, and it's our commitment to collecting and analyzing data from multiple sources and perspectives to identify problems as well as solutions. And then the fourth core component is distributed leadership, and it is an equity-minded approach to leadership that is our collective commitment to lead and implement change that's unified by a shared vision. So as a way to concretize these 4 components, we developed the EDI SelfAssessment Tool as a way to help provide users with some key guiding questions to help individuals and or teams self-assess its programs, processes, practice, or policies in a way that really promotes and facilitates inquiry. So through the tool, we designed it with the minds that it would encourage thoughtful reflection and dialogue on how these efforts reflect the constructs in each of the core components that were described in the framework, facilitates and helps establish a baseline understanding and standing of how equitable efforts are, and ideally helps identify actions and resources and opportunities for improvement after that inquiry process. So what we'll be sharing with you today are results from the pilot activities that we conducted both internally within the organization as well as externally by San Diego Miramar to test the tool in terms of how useful and helpful was the tool in helping to promote the inquiry needed to advance equity. So the first pilot that we'll be sharing is using the tool to take a look at and reflect on one of our board committees. So one of our board committees is the Research Advisory Committee, and this committee is comprised of board members as well as staff members working to help move forward the research agenda for the organization, as well as develop resources and tools for the field. So when we as a committee completed the tool, we felt that not all of the questions felt applicable to the committee work itself. But what it did was really help surface and reinforce the interdependency of the committee work with other areas of the organization. And this wasn't just limited to the interdependency of this one committee with the other board committees within the organization, but it was also around some of the other operational or functional areas and needs of the organization, such as resource development. Because in this committee, we have many conversations about priorities and needs that the field has. And so that work helps inform some of the work we think about and implement around professional development, as well as research and evaluation. What the use of the tool also helped surface was the need for a companion action plan to help us map out the next steps identified during the self-assessment process. So the tool itself has sections that help sort of promote and facilitate the inquiry. And there are also areas that help identify potential opportunities. But in completing the tool as a group, we felt that it would have been helpful to also have had sort of a companion piece that allowed us to document all in one place the potential actions that cut across all of the various core components, but also were ones that were distinct and required special attention for. So as a result of this pilot, in reflecting on our research advisory committee process using the tool, what it did for us was really increase awareness and awareness and promotion of RAC created resources among IRPE communities. So we felt that, after sort of doing the self-assessment and self-reflection process, that there was more that we could do to make sure that those resources that were being created by your fellow IRPE practitioners who are board members could be shared more broadly and consistently, so that there was broader access to the tools. What it also did was help us identify the need to improve the resource creation process to ensure that we're really meeting the needs of the field, and we're identifying topics for the resources that are prioritizing those topics that are of utmost importance for the field. And then it also surfaced for us a need to facilitate perhaps a deeper level of engagement with the field around the actual design and application of the resources. So up until this point, in the last year and a half, the heavy lifting has been done by the actual committee members as well as staff. And in kind of talking through and working through some of the examples and the experiences of the creation of the tools, we felt that for some of the resources and tools, the tools could have been more robust, or could be more robust, if we were able to tap into and leverage the expertise of more members and field members in the fields for these resources. So in this upcoming year, we're going to be looking at how we might be able to engage the field around the design and application of upcoming resources that are identified within the committee. So now that I've shared with you some of the reflections from us using it in a shared governance committee, I'll now pass it to Darla to speak on the piloting we did around our hiring and recruitment processes.
Thank you, Alyssa. So again, we wanted to pick something internal to kind of test out, to pilot the tool to see how it would work for us. So the first thing that I thought of was hiring and looking at our hiring practices. So when we went through, and I did this with our HR person, we realized that the tool needed to make sure that people were focusing on the discussion that the tool is meant to guide and facilitate, and it's not an exercise. It's not a, well, I did it, or it's not a, I filled it out, I'm done. But it should be done in a group not one person in their office. It should be used again as that vehicle that kind of really spawns inquiry. So we wanted to make sure that we put that note in the tool. I said, and it's obvious to some, but we figured that really should be there. As Alyssa mentioned, when we created the tool, I think we were trying to bridge this, nonprofit organization, community college, higher education institution. And as we were going through it, looking at, again, at our own hiring practices, there were questions where we went, I don't think that applies to us. So we kind of made note of those. And again, as Alyssa mentioned, we ended up having 2 different versions of the tool, one for community colleges or other, again, higher education institutions, and one for nonprofit organizations that may be similar to the RP group. And then obviously the biggest takeaway from the process is that we have work to do to better ensure equity in our hiring process and practices. So the next slide is just, you'll see there's a lot on here, is a list. So again, I won't read all of these, but these are some of the things that we're looking at the next time that we have a position to hire for our employees. So again, looking at where we post jobs, we're looking at how we can collect applicant demographics, because I think it's important to look at not just who do you hire, but who applied and who got to the first level interview and who got to the second level interview and then who got selected, so that you're looking at the demographics in the context of who is already within the organization. That we want to play a bigger role with the colleges in terms of this idea of an IRPE career pipeline. When we did the webinar about the demographics, we had a wonderful discussion and got this is where this idea kind of also came from, in terms of we can play a role in planting those seeds and creating those who will follow us, our successors, and looking at, and especially if our goal is to diversify the field, why don't we start with the students on our own campuses and just letting, because I think I did the whole thing where I asked people, how many of you knew when you were an undergrad that you were going to be here today? You were going to be an institutional researcher at a community college. And I don't think a single person raised their hand. Even in graduate school, people didn't know. And it's, if you ever want to have kind of interesting conversations with a group of researchers, ask them all how they got here. Because there's some really interesting paths that people take, prior careers, interesting majors that they studied in school that are completely unrelated to, or at least seemingly unrelated. So anyway, we have a very diverse population on our community college campuses. What can we be doing to at least raise awareness among that population about this career field? Data science, as it's often being called, versus statistics. And research and things like that. But we want to play a bigger role in that. We want to, put our interview protocols through a screener to make sure that we're not using biased language. The same with our job announcements. We want to ask people after they've been hired to share with us what was the hiring experience like. We need to look at our degree requirements. Are they cutting out, excluding people that would actually be a good, fit for a job? Or is that I think the paper ceiling? I've been hearing that term. I believe that's what somebody could correct me if I'm not correct. And then looking at the possibility of providing more training for our hiring committees. As those of you who are on college campuses, I remember this, that you have to go through a training before you can participate on a hiring committee. So again, these are all things that came out of our discussion and completing the tool. I think I hand it to Daniel to talk about what it was like for a college.
All right. Thank you, Darla, very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Before I jump into this part of the presentation, I would first like to acknowledge one of our co-presenters that couldn't be here today, Dr. Nisa Julian. She is the Associate Dean of Academic Success and Integrated Support Services here at San Diego Miramar College. And she was the one that actually led the efforts of piloting the tool under my management. So I definitely want to acknowledge her work in piloting the tool, as well as her contributing to this presentation today, but unfortunately she couldn't be here. So that being said, in this part of the presentation, we are now going to focus on how San Diego Miramar College piloted the EDI self-assessment tool. We will review how we utilize the framework as a tool in the development of our student equity plan, how we designed our work groups, how we utilized the tool during our work group inquiry process, how we analyzed our work and developed themes, translated the information into the development of the plan, and lastly, we'll review our next steps in our equity planning process and how we plan to continue using the tool moving forward. Next slide, please. Okay. So when presented with the opportunity to pilot the EDI assessment tool, we were very excited because this was at around the same time that the new equity plan template was being released. And given that the equity plan template was developed independent of this tool, we actually saw the opportunity to use the tool to complete our equity plan. So the components of the framework tie really nicely with how we at Miramar are progressing in our equity journey. So the first thing we did was we looked at our previous equity planning process, and we developed 5 work groups composed of faculty, classified professionals, administrators, and students. The 5 work groups aligned with each of the metrics of the equity plan. We held meetings with all work group members to review components of the plan, our college data, our prior equity plan in progress, and we reviewed the framework and the assessment tool in of itself. Each work group team had various meetings throughout the spring and summer terms to review the information and complete the assessment tool specific for the metric and for each DI group we identified. So our lead office, which actually stands for Leading for Equity, Anti-Racism, and Diversity, that is our actual equity office at Miramar, worked with all the work groups to help facilitate conversation around inquiry utilizing the assessment tool. So upon each work group's completion of the tool, the lead office reviewed all of the worksheets to code and theme the information. So moving forward now, we are going to preview some examples of the process in the following slides. So next slide. Okay, so here we have some animations to show you how we really went from the assessment tool itself to actually fleshing out the narrative of the equity plan itself. So this is an example of our math and English work group team's worksheet that focused specifically on the cultural humility component of the framework and assessment tool. And we focused on our Black African American student DI group. So that's what you see on the left-hand side here. And so if you can do the animation there. There we go. Here we zeroed in on student success, on the student success barriers portion of the assessment tool. The work groups completed each section as they conducted a review of our current practices regarding this metric. The success barrier section of the assessment tool aligns with the current structure evaluation of the equity plan. So when you looked at the equity plan, you had to speak to what your current structures are in the evaluation around instruction, wraparound services, budgeting, and administration. Next slide, please. There we go. So we were able to take that information and write a narrative for the part of the equity plan based on that inquiry utilizing the assessment tool. So all you just see here is our narrative that actually went into the equity plan in of itself. Next slide. Here's another example. Again, it's the same work group, the transfer level math and English, focusing on the cultural humility component of the assessment tool with a focus on our African American Black DI population. Animation. All right. So similar to the previous slide, here we zeroed in this time on next steps and resources needed section of the assessment tool. Again, the work groups completed each section through their review, this time of the ideal next steps regarding this metric. So last time it was the actual current structure. Now we're focusing on the ideal structure. Then the next step resources portion of the tool aligns with the ideal structure of the equity plan. Next slide, please. There we go. And again, we were then able to write the narrative for this part of the equity plan based upon the inquiry utilizing the EDI assessment tool. And this is just the narrative that went in there.
Daniel, sorry to interrupt, but we had a question if you could repeat what LEAD stands for again.
Absolutely. So our LEAD office stands for Leading Equity, Anti-Racism, and Diversity Office. That's the acronym. Okay. So with this slide, this is an example of the total inquiry that came out of the completion of transfer level math and English in the first year within the district work group. So what you see here is a crosswalk with the actual 4 components of the framework and the assessment tool. And then the top portion are the components of the assessment tool in of themselves when you go through the inquiry. So when you crosswalk, let's say cultural humility with challenges and barriers, what was identified was that there was a lack of financial resources and funding, that not all voices are present at the table when it comes to our strategic enrollment management. For example, we found out that courses are being canceled that have high DI populations, and also determining which modalities work best for our DI students. Another example within this crosswalk is if you were to look at evidence-based with next steps. So you'll see in the third column, bottom row there, where it says review what data is missing. PRED is our actual program review equity data dashboard, and we use it for our instructional area, but we're also building it out for non-instructional area too. But specifically, we're at a point where we're building out our equity data dashboard for our ACPs, which are our academic and career pathways, and disaggregating that by our DI populations. So basically, this example shows the need to focus on our ongoing dialogue and simply not checking the box for compliance purposes, pretty much what Darla stated in regards to the pilots that were ran within the IRPE group. We want to make sure that there's dialogue, that the dialogue is meaningful, and that we continue that dialogue moving forward. And it's not just, okay, the plan's done, check the box, and we move on, okay? And so the inquiry dialogue contributes to identifying barriers in our current structure and the need to build towards an ideal structure within our college. Next slide, please. Okay. So once we had our 5 work groups finish the inquiry process by utilizing the EDI assessment tool, we had 6 overarching barriers that came out of the process. And so here's a summary table of what came out from the inquiry process. The information, again, was coded, and these are the themes that came out of the process. So in particular, resources to directly support efforts to close the equity gaps among our DI groups relative to the success metric. Our second one, quantitative, qualitative data to determine areas of strength and weaknesses to help support our DI groups. Third barrier, DI representation and staffing across faculty, classified professionals, administrators to reflect our DI student groups. 4, targeted professional development on strategies and practices to support DI student group success. 5, structures in our program to support success of our DI student groups and engagement opportunities within our campus. And finally, materials and curriculum and programming related to our DI student groups, history, experiences, and culture, namely materials that are representative of those specific DI communities, which we found to be very important. So utilizing the assessment tool really helped us uncover these overarching barriers, which we will focus on through action and implementation of our equity plan. These identified barriers show the difference between the current and ideal structures as identified in our equity plan. So as a college, we will be focusing our efforts on how to systematically address these barriers and building towards an ideal structure. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk very generally about what our next steps are grounded in. First and foremost, all of our equity efforts stem from the college's strategic plan, namely our strategic goals. Our 5 strategic goals provide the North Star for the college over a 7-year planning cycle. The college's guided pathways efforts will help provide insight into what the ideal structure will look like, and equity will be centered within these efforts as well. Next slide. So here's a little bit more details on our next steps. So even though we have submitted our equity plan, like all of you did, right, last month already, no, 2 months ago, we plan to continue to use the equity framework and the EDI assessment tool to conduct further inquiry and developing specific actions to center our work and supporting our specific DI groups that have been identified. Here we're providing 2 examples in which we're going to utilize the tools as we make changes to some of our existing programs, including our JETS Jumpstart program, which is our student orientation, and our Light the Fire professional development series, which is a connection to our guided pathways work. And that's basically taking courses that will focus on changing pedagogy within the classroom. As we make changes to each of these programs, we plan on utilizing the tool to further examine each of the equity framework components to ensure that we center our work on supporting the success of our students, in particular, our DI population with an equity lens. So once we start to move on those action steps, the ultimate goal is to tie this back into our integrated planning efforts. Based upon our inquiry and action examples just stated, what we plan on doing is redesigning our educational master plan. Currently, our equity plan has been a functional plan. And what we realized in doing the inquiry process by utilizing the EDI assessment tool is that we need to raise the profile of our equity plan to the same level of our strategic plan. So in essence, we're going to redesign our educational master plan and see what that's going to look like moving forward. This is going to be grounded in what we're calling our integration efforts. So at the current moment, San Diego Miramar College is focusing on integrating our institutional effectiveness, guided pathways, and our EDI work. And these integration efforts will center equity within the college. So that being said, I will now kick it over to Alyssa.
Thank you, Daniel. So what did we learn from these 3 pilot processes we engaged in around the tool? So what we learned was that the tool really helped to kind of surface and reinforce the interdependencies of what we were examining with the other areas of the organization, whether it be within our organization at the IRPE group or at the college at San Diego Miramar. What it also did was prompt an assessment that really focused on what were those institutional components that needed to change. And this is reflected in the way the tool was designed in helping to sort of identify what are the current practices and processes that either align or don't align with our equity principles. And based on that inquiry and reflection process, what do we need to do to get us to a place where those practices, processes are more in alignment with those equity ideals? What it also did was, at least for the organization, surface the need for a companion piece to kind of map out what those actions were that were identified during the assessment and inquiry process. So in San Diego Miramar's example, conveniently, the SEAP served as a very nice companion piece as a way to kind of translate the documented inquiry process through the core components into what was needed to reflect what the college was intending to do to address some of the equity areas that are identified in the plan. And then the other thing that we reflected on in terms of what we learned from this process was that while there were redundancies across the tool that elicited similar responses during discussions, we felt that those redundancies were important and needed because it really reinforced what was working and what was not, and what aligned and what didn't align to our equity ideals. So now that we've shared with you the learnings from our pilot, you're probably wondering, well, what does the tool look like? So in San Diego Miramar's example, they gave you a quick snippet of what the tool looked like. And so what we'll do in the next few minutes is just kind of do a walkthrough of the tool so that you can see concretely how we started concretizing or operationalizing those 4 component areas to facilitate inquiry based on the framework. So just need some quick validation that you all see the self-assessment tool. Perfect, thank you. So the version that I'm sharing here is the version for the colleges. And on the first page, it simply just kind of reasserts the IRPE group's commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and includes our equity commitment statement around advancing equity. It also then provides some instructions in terms of how the tool is envisioned for usage. And so we highlight here that the tool itself was designed to be completed by a group or a team and not by any individual, because the intent here is that you are having thoughtful and meaningful conversations about whatever process, practice, or program or policy you're looking at. So here, what we highlight is that under each of the core components, there is going to be detailed assessment that kind of reflects and gives the users time to reflect and document where they currently stand around the practice, process, program, or policy you're assessing on, and then any planned next steps or timelines. And so here, similar to what is laid out in the SEAP, where you first document where you currently stand, and then you provide some narrative around what your ideal is. The tool was designed to capture steps towards how you might be able to document what the current and ideal processes are. So here, what you'll find is for every core component, there is the brief description of what the core component is. And so here in this example that you see here, the first one is equity-minded. And then the guiding questions that are used for the core component are based on the detailed descriptions of each of the core component descriptions. And so here what we did was, as a way, again, to concretize or operationalize what it meant to be equity-minded, we took apart the definition to then create guiding questions or prompts that would enable the users to engage in thoughtful dialogue and conversation and discussion around that specific core component. And so for each prompting question, there is the column that says standing progress includes reflections that ask the teams to reflect on the success and progress of the specific program, process, practice, or policy you're self-assessing, and then identify any challenges and barriers that you are currently facing around that program, process, practice, or policy. So once you take stock of what the current standing or progress is, the next column is where users can document the next steps and or supports. And so here in this next column, this reflects and provides the content that maps nicely to the ideal portion of the SEAP, as Daniel mentioned. And so in this portion of the tool, the teams can identify any potential next steps or areas of focus based on the self-reflection around whether or not the program, process, practice, or policy is, in this first one, whether it considers and prioritizes groups that have been historically marginalized, and then identify any of the supports and resources needed. So you'll see here for the equity-minded, there are several questions that try to facilitate or prompt dialogue amongst the team members to think about how their program, practice, or policy may be equity or minded based on these prompts provided. And so you'll see for the equity minded, there are 4. And then the same thing happens for each of the subsequent core components. So you've got a short description and then prompts that identify ways of how the program, practice, or policy is operationalized or reflects cultural humility. So I won't go through every single one, but that hopefully gives you a good sense of how this tool has been created. And then at the very end, there is then sort of a summative reflection in terms of the team's overall assessment of where it stands in relation to the equity framework for advancing equity. And so this was modeled from the Guided Pathways self-assessment tool for colleges to kind of reflect on where they stand overall. And so here we use four assessment items to check the overall level of alignment that the program, process, practice, or policy has to the IRPE equity framework. And so you've got fully aligned, where it demonstrates full alignment to the framework with no support or resources needed. The second option is mostly aligned, where in reflecting across the tool, most of it aligned, but there are still some areas that can be worked on. Somewhat aligned, where there's some alignment, but not in most of the areas of the framework and really requires significant support or resources in some of the areas. And then the final one is not at all aligned. And again, this should be done and discussed among the team members in terms of reflecting based on the inquiry process engaged through the use of the tool. So now that we have provided a quick, oh yes.
There was the last page that we added.
Oh yes, thank you, Darla. So then the last page is, so earlier we mentioned that as we were engaging in this process, what was missing was the companion piece. So since then, we've added a companion piece in the last page where the users can develop the action plan based on the reflections that were made through the self-assessment tool. So here we've got a very simple template for colleges to use to help them summarize all of the priorities and the areas needed into one place that can be entered from the next steps or area of focus and support areas. So with that, we're going to take a quick pause for any questions that attendees may have based on the pilot process or the tool before we move on to the Living EDI Glossary. So please feel free to type in any questions you may have.
Alyssa, there's a question in your Q&A. Was there diverse representation by the committees performing the assessments and group self-evaluations?
Yes, so I would say in general, yes. So in the Research Advisory Committee, it is comprised of both board members and staff team members. And I would say that in general, it was a pretty diverse group of individuals that included both diversity in racial and ethnic makeup, but also gender as well as position.
I can answer for San Diego Miramar College. We did have 5 work groups that were based upon the metrics identified in the equity plan. What I didn't mention in the presentation was those 5 work groups were created in the midst of our governance structure and process. So we have a main committee called our Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism Committee, or also known as IDEA. And so IDEA created those 5 work groups. And of course, as mentioned in the presentation, had representation across administration, classified professionals, faculty, and students, but we also did have some good diversity as far as racial, ethnic makeup as well.
So we'll give people a minute or two in case you are typing before we move on to the next segment.
Well, I know this question hasn't been asked, but I'm going to answer it, which is how do we get a hold of this tool? We being you. And so we will be posting it on our website, and it's not there yet. We're just putting the final touches on it, but the, oops, wrong link. Sorry, I copied and pasted, and then I copied and pasted, and then I copied and pasted. But I have it here. That probably will actually be the link. But I wanted to share with you, this is the link to our EDI webpage, and that's where all of these tools are. But the link that I posted there, I think we changed the permission, so good for you for being here today, because you get advanced access to the tool. It is a Google Doc meant and we did that intentionally instead of making it a PDF for 2 reasons. One, it may change. You all may have suggestions as we continue to use this tool. We'll get more feedback and we'll make changes to the tool. The second thing is we didn't want to give you a PDF because those are hard to use. So by putting it in a Google Doc, what you can do is either download it as a Google Doc or you can download it as a Word doc. And that way you can use it as you wish to do that. But that's why we went with that approach as opposed to that. And again, if you go to the EDI website, you'll see, if you click on where it says self-assessment, I don't think that we updated it quite yet. It still says coming soon, but we will definitely send out a notice like through the super brief, just to make sure that people know that that it's there. And same thing for the glossary. When that is done, that will also be posted. I don't see any more questions yet. Feel free if things arise as we continue on to put those in the Q&A. And again, we have time at the end to answer those questions.
Okay, my turn. So the RP group created a glossary of commonly used terms in equity, diversity, inclusion work to help establish common language amongst not just practitioners in the community college system, but specifically within our IRPE field. So in this section of the webinar, I will give you a sneak peek of our living glossary and walk you through some example terms, including how they're defined and other information that will accompany the term definition in the glossary. Next slide, please. So why is the glossary useful? I thought I'd include a kind of a fun and silly anecdote to emphasize why having common language and shared language can be beneficial. So I actually borrowed this from an article in the Washington Post about intergenerational differences and how we communicate in the language we use in the workplace. So on the screen is a message one colleague sent to another in Slack. Hey, my kid just came down with the fever, going to be out of pocket today, FYI. Next slide, please. So what do you think out of pocket mean? What does it mean to you? So we're going to actually do this kind of interactive Zoom style. So Alyssa, if you can post the Zoom poll. So the choices are A, I am unavailable to work today. B, my clothing is out of pockets. Or C, I plan to do something wild, crazy, or inappropriate. So I'll give you a couple minutes, and Alyssa, give me a clue if you can see how many folks have actually completed the poll.
So it looks like we're still getting people completing it. As of right now,
Okay.
37 of the 52.
Don't Google it.
And there's definitely a clear sort of choice in terms of what people think it means. So it looks like we don't have any more responses coming in. So the top choice at 74% is I am unavailable to work today. And then the next choice, the next choice is I plan to do something wild, crazy, or inappropriate at 26%. No one thought that it meant my clothing is out of pockets.
That's too literal. Thank you. So if you can click so you can highlight, I think I had a little graphic. So the person who wrote the message was a Gen Xer. I always get the letters confused, and used the term out of pocket to mean I am unavailable to work today. But the article was sharing kind of a funny anecdote about most, like in the workplace, the person who received the message was a Gen Zer. And she thought that her colleague was just gonna wild out. And so you can see how different meanings of terms and even like a phrase like out of pocket can cause confusion, even if it is kind of, you know, between two colleagues. So next slide, please. Thank you. So this is an example. I know it's in a silly way. I'm just demonstrating how important shared understanding of common vocabulary is, because the glossary really helps us to get on the same page, creates the foundation so that we can be more effective when we communicate with one another, particularly around really sensitive and emotionally charged discussions related to when we're discussing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's very useful, right, for a glossary because it helps us avoid misunderstandings. So when we have the same understanding of terms and concepts, we build our capacity to better actively engage in the equity, diversity, inclusion work, and for us to be more effective in our work. So we are hoping that this EDI IRPE Living Glossary adds value to your current work as a tool to help you navigate any difficult conversations that stem from, the uncomfortable truths that we bring to our campuses as IRPE professionals when we present equity data. It's uncomfortable. So I think a glossary can be a good tool, not just for ourselves, but that we can share with our colleagues to create shared understanding. We hope that this glossary can help IRPE professionals become more fluent and proficient in all these interrelated concepts as we discuss justice and equity and inclusion, so that we're better able to use the language and describe data in ways that is affirming and uplifts the voice and the experiences of those who are minoritized in our system. And so the purpose of creating the living glossary, as Darla said, the glossary was originally developed by members of the subcommittee of the IRPE Group's EDI Committee, so props to them. And they started actually by adapting the terms and definitions used in the Chancellor's Office system DEI glossary of terms. So that's where we started. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the glossary has been edited further by Darla and I to ensure a unified voice and speaker. Obviously, there were lots of members of the subcommittee, and so just to make sure that we had a common voice. And this glossary is kind of fancy. It's not just a glossary of definitions. We actually go beyond that. So it includes, in addition to the definition, 3 different components. So for each term, we describe like what scenario or circumstances or conversations that we are most likely to encounter the term, particularly in our work. So this is the IRPE context. The glossary includes a section that makes a case for how we as IRPE professionals can use the term, or why it's important and how we can apply it to our work. And then lastly, we included with each term some resources and links to videos, podcasts, articles, books, websites. I put in a couple of Twitter quotes from scholars that I felt like kind of helped clarify what the term meant. And really the purpose of that was for us to be more curious and inviting ourselves to learn more. It's not just knowing the definition of a term really probably won't help us clearly grasp and understand kind of the depth and the context of some of the terms that we have in the glossary. So a few notes about managing expectations of the glossary. So definitely we're offering the best definition that we felt, that may be applied in our context in IRPE, but there are other known definitions of the same terms. We are open to suggestions. Actually, in the glossary, there's a link where you can actually provide your input for, hey, maybe we can clarify or we can edit a definition, even suggestions for new terms that we can include. So secondly, you may have caught on that we are calling this not just a glossary, but a living glossary. So the living part signifies, the ever-changing nature of language in general, right? So we know that the list is not comprehensive. The new terms, kind of bubble up in the field in the scholarship. For example, race lighting, like that was not a thing, right? Gaslighting was, right? But that. So there are new terms that come up that maybe we can include, but we wanted to start with that original list with the Chancellor's Office DEI glossary. So we plan to update the glossary regularly and respond to kind of the continuously evolving meanings and the terms used kind of in this work. Lastly, the glossary is a tool. Is we just look at it as a starting place for your personal journey, equity journey, but also your professional work and on your campus, no matter what position you're in, how you're situated. So it's not going to be a tool that solves all of your problems. We still, if you want to engage in this work, the work will still be difficult, right? Because we're dealing with humans, but we are hoping that the glossary can help facilitate, and help us actually prompt some ideas and foster, different ways to integrate like our role in how we present data and how we discuss data to kind of influence the climate of the colleges and organizations we work at. So Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you an example of two terms. So the first example is the term bias. So here we are defining that as a preference or opinion that interferes with impartial judgment of someone or an individual or group, right? And here we're saying that everyone has bias, and not all bias is bad, right? They are necessary cognitive function in a way, right? But so that I think, so next click, please, Alyssa, sorry. And so the next kind of section of that term is, where bias could show up in our work. So, for example, we may hear statements when we're presenting data that represent biases that our colleagues have about students or racially minoritized students. And it's important for us to be aware of it because we're not just, stewards of the data, that we bring the data to the campus, but we're often asked to be facilitators of the sense making of the data. So we have the influence, and power to be able to affect how that discussion happens. And bias actually, negative biases can lead to deficit-minded thinking, right? Where we are just blaming students. And it ultimately affects our ability as colleges to act and change in ways that actually address the gaps that we see. Next slide, please. So for the same term, so we have the context, like where we might hear it. And then here we, the salience application section of the glossary, it varies a lot, but really essentially is how can you use this term? And so these are just suggestions from those who developed the glossary. But here, you can see that we put in this section, like, maybe in our role, we can disrupt biased thinking, right? And that's how one way we can advance the work. One more click, please, Alyssa. And lastly, the resources. So we are planning to link related terms within the glossary, as well as link resources when available. So this is an example. So I want to share with you how my college, I'm Hannah from Santa Monica College, how we used the idea of bias. It wasn't very explicit. I didn't share a definition of bias at our institution, but we had a reflection activity for faculty who looked at disaggregated course success data, disaggregated by student race and ethnicity. And we actually prompted them to bring their biases about how students learn, how they behave, to the surface. So we had, after looking at data, this what we call the student narrative activity or reflection, where we actually asked folks to say, like, where do these biases come from? Like, what are some experiences that have led to these biases and then eventually led to prejudices? And is there some way you can unlearn them, right? So, so that is how one way that we used a term like bias. And, everyone is biased, right? And so people get really defensive on my campus, and maybe I felt that they didn't have a clear understanding of how bias functions. And so this is one way to say, we all have biases, right? It's human nature. How can we bring them to the surface and unlearn the ones that are harming our students, particularly our racially minoritized students? So that is one example of how we've used this. The second example, next slide, please, is color blindness. So the term is defined as when like a belief of like, oh, like we're all the same, we all color doesn't matter, right? The color of our skin doesn't matter. The next click, please, Alyssa. And so why we thought that this term was important to include is, while we may not use the term color blindness in our like everyday work, and we might not hear it, I think this can help us understand why people respond to the equity data in the way that they do, right? Oftentimes people get very personal, like, no, I'm not a racist, I don't see race, right? But I think understanding that and actually putting like a name to, oh, this is what's happening, this is the belief system that's influencing someone to behave this way, it better equips us to be able to respond in that situation. To center the minoritized group or individual, right, that's directed at. And it, helps us to, not let our colleagues off the hook, right? So we're oftentimes in our institutions, when we're talking about like racial equity and institutional racism, we're talking about like systems and structures and policies, and it's not about like this individual is biased or prejudiced and discriminatory or racist. So I think that understanding this concept will enable us to better respond in these situations. Next slide. And so another example of the application, so I kind of just explained this already, but just helping us being aware of the underlying motivations and the why someone would respond in this way. And it's very prevalent, right? And so I don't think we talk about and name it explicitly, that this is what's happening and this is an active barrier for us to get deeper into our conversations or to jump from data to action, right, or change. So I chose this term as a second example because I also want to point out in the Learn More section, we also include, like this one includes like a statement. It's not like a link to a resource, but like acknowledging the limitations of the term, right? Colorblindness is ableist language, right? And so acknowledging that, right? And that it's limited. But it is commonly used in the scholarship. So for now, we're not like other terms like race neutral or racelessness hasn't really entered, I think, prominently in our like lexicon. And so, like we're just making a note of that, that we are using this, but we know that it is problematic. So, so that is, yeah, that's all we have for this section of the glossary. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. So be happy and willing to take any questions. I see one question. Oh, it's a question for Daniel.
All right, thank you, Hannah. So the question reads, I'm interested in the process of using the framework. It is a great framework, but feels dense. So during the process, how much time did you use in studying the tool together in the beginning, or did you do it at all? So given that Miramar College was piloting the framework and the tool, what we did is, as soon as we started to form the 5 work groups under the IDEA Committee, the first thing the work groups did before we even jumped into the equity plan template, we focused our efforts on the framework and the tool. So yes, we did spend some time looking over the framework, looking over the tool in of itself. That was probably, gosh, we started that in April and May, around that time. So we did do a really good in-depth inquiry into, well, not inquiry, but just an in-depth look at the tool itself, so that the work groups can give it a pretty good understanding of just what the questions are and how the tool operates. And so they felt comfortable enough to apply it to the equity plan template and the work moving forward.
Thank you, Daniel. Any questions for Hannah or the group about the EDI glossary that was just shared? So as Hannah mentioned, we started with the Chancellor's Office DEI or DEI glossary. And since then, it's bloomed a little bit more in terms of, as we were kind of working through identifying the IRPE context for it. And so we have a question from an attendee. Does the tool consider all ethnic groups, including Latinx, Asian, Native American, Asian American in particular, can be very complex in terms of ethnic breakdown? So are you referring to the EDI glossary or the self-assessment tool? So the self-assessment tool, the language used in it is more broad. And so I would say covers sort of if these are the groups and any further disaggregations of the group is of importance. for the work, that those groups be identified. In terms of the EDI glossary, we don't call out any specific ethnic groups per se. The glossary was more in terms of the intent was to identify those commonly used phrases and terms we hear when we're trying to facilitate a shared and common understanding and language to talk about equity. And so any references to any groups, again, will be very context specific, but totally agree that like the Asian American, and you must have been in the same room with us just the other day when we were talking about the Asian American population and how there is sort of this monolithic perspective we take when we look at that group in particular, and how by not disaggregating that group, we're kind of masking some of the inequities in outcomes and experiences that some of those subpopulations share with some of our more prominent groups that we typically associate with inequities.
Alyssa, I can also piggyback on the tool piece. When we paired the assessment tool with the student equity plan template, and we started to do a deeper dive into the DI population data and disaggregate it. It did allow us to really dive into the data in of itself and have some really good conversation. So the tool in of itself does lend itself to looking at disaggregated data specific to DI populations in the equity plan.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, any other questions related to the glossary? Or any of the tools broadly? Okay, I see none. So Daniel?
Yes. All right. So today you learned two new things, the assessment tool and the wonderful glossary that's being put together by Darla and Hannah. And so given that you have these two awesome resources that are going to be available to you soon, how can you use them together? Well, I'm hoping to provide some examples as to how San Diego Miramar College plans on using the glossary moving forward. Okay, so provide some practical ways in which both the tool and the glossary are complementary. San Diego Miramar College has been engaging in what we're calling Committee of Inquiry Professional Development Series. So we're moving into our third semester of hosting our community of inquiries. When we submitted the plan back in November, we held 5 sessions towards the end of the fall semester, focused how we can support our Black and Latinx students. Those were the ones, the DI populations that stood out in our equity plan. So part of these community of inquiry dialogues included topics ranging from the data itself, how the deficit model is harming our students, to race lighting. So that was really kind of end of November, early December. Moving into the spring term, our community of inquiry groups are going to start to incorporate terms found in the EDI glossary into our conversations. And of course, we're going to ground that in the data that we have specific to the college. And this is going to help shape additional action items for our DI groups. So our work around equity is constantly evolving, and we will continue to utilize the tools to help us transform into a student-ready college at Miramar. Utilizing the assessment tool has helped us understand as an institution where we were, where we are, but more importantly, who we strive to be moving forward. It has helped us in our intentionality around equity, as we have committed to ensuring that it is centered at our institution, but not only submitting the plan as a compliance piece, but through our action in how we conduct campus conversations. And we have campus conversations that continue on from when we have our equity summit every fall to our fall and spring kickoff events, and our next one being next week, to our annual planning summit, in which we have in the spring term. So we continue on these conversations, and as we were able to pilot the assessment tool and now see the EDI glossary blossom and mature and evolve, we're going to bring that into the conversation to ensure that equity EDI is grounded in everything we do as a college, and ensure that we are a student-ready campus as we help to close achievement gaps here as an institution.
So with that, we are at the conclusion of our webinar sharing the two EDI tools that we've developed. We've got some time left, so are there any other questions and or comments? Feel free to add that to the Q&A. If there are none, we will wrap up and end the webinar.
I just want to remind people again, if both of these will be posted on our EDI webpage, and we will send out announcements so that you know when they're ready. We're trying to get it done this week. So stay tuned. And I also want to thank my fellow presenters, Alyssa and Daniel and Hannah, for the heavy lifting that is this work, and their dedication, their commitment. And we really do hope that the tools that we've created will prove useful in our system and hopefully beyond. But thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it.